Hi, I'm Professor Wolf from the English department. Welcome to the inaugural event of a series called Conversations with Warrior Authors and Artists. We'll be aiming to do this twice a semester, and it will feature staff, faculty, and graduates from our campus community who have done research or creative work. There will often be two people. They'll often be in this space, sometimes in other campus locations. And you can mark your calendars for the next one of these, Tuesday, April 25th in this room at this time, 12 to 1:30. We'll be doing our next event. Publicity will come out soon. So I'd like to thank the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, whose dean is here, and the Office of Graduate Studies and Research, who is also represented back there helping out with our tech. Thank you, they've made this event possible, as well as the library for making this space available. So I'll be interviewing both of our faculty authors, first Ryan in the middle and then Sebastian. There'll be time for audience Q&A afterwards, but please hold your questions until I'm done talking to both authors. We'll go until about 1:30. If you have to leave before then, I understand, but please be as discreet as you can. All right, I'll join you guys here, starting with Ryan. So first, can you remind us about your department and your specialty?
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. There we go. Thank you for coming to this. So yeah, my name is Ryan Logan. I am a medical anthropologist by training. I have a PhD in applied anthropology, specialization, medical anthropology, and I also have a Master of Public Health. And I joined the faculty here at Stan State straight out of grad school in the fall of 2019.
I've been emailing with Ryan to get ready for this event. I just got to meet him in person. Now, I guess COVID has meant that you joined the faculty at a somewhat inconvenient time for meeting people face to face. So now we get to do this, which is nice. Okay, so here's your book, and it's also up there on the wall. Boundaries of Care, Community Health Workers in the United States. Can you summarize what its aims are?
Yeah, so largely, hello, there we go. So largely, my book is focused on, basically, my book is focused on the lived experience of community health workers. And I'll be talking, of course, more about who community health workers are. Thank you. Does this work better? There we go. The lived experience of community health workers, who are essentially non-clinical health workers who come from the communities they work within. So the large aim of the book is to share their lived experience, their stories tied in with theoretical analysis, to one, share that lived experience, and two, serve as a way to spread awareness about community health workers, who they are, why we need them, ways that employers and governments, if they're developing policy around these workers, can understand the challenges, the successes, and the ramifications of incorporating them into their workforce.
How about me? I'm on. Okay. So I learned a ton. I didn't know about community health workers previously. How do they differ from a doctor or a nurse or other healthcare workers?
That's a great question, and I get that a lot. So there's a great definition. I used the American Public Health Association's definition of a community health worker because it was written by the community health workers section. So it's a community health worker driven definition. I don't have it memorized because it's pretty long, but the major aspects of that, as I said previously, they come from the communities they work within, and they're not doing clinical skills. So they're not giving vaccinations in the US. They're not doing anything like surgeries or like that. They're really helping people outside the clinic, outside of healthcare centers, which I think is a huge missing component in healthcare in general, especially in the US. We think about healthcare occurring, you go to the doctor and the doctor prescribes you medicine or tells you what's wrong and you go away. But so much of health occurs outside. Can you get to the doctor's office? Can you afford the doctor's office? Do you speak the language of the doctor? Are there forms in your language? The community health worker is there. They're a part of your community. They share your culture. They share the same, usually the same educational background, socioeconomic status. They just know how to navigate that and how to help you get through that. And so those are some of the skills community health workers have. You might see on the global stage throughout African countries, Asia, Some community health workers are trained to do things like vaccination and kind of basic clinical skills, but in the US, usually not.
So you did this work in Indiana, right? So can you tell us a little more about the populations there of the clients and the CHWs?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm from Indiana. I went to my undergrad and my master's degree are from Indiana University, and I had previously worked with a community health worker organization there that I later collaborated with for my research. Indiana is still predominantly a white state, but it is increasingly diverse, especially in urban areas. Indiana had some of the largest Burmese refugee communities come into Indianapolis, as well as Fort Wayne. Evansville, which is in the southeastern part of the state, has quite a diverse population. The rural population of Indiana is still largely white, but there is increasing diversity there as well, particularly Latinx immigrants. Migrant farm workers come through quite a bit following the harvest as well. And so community health workers are in all those different communities, and sometimes even special outreach to, for example, when migrant farm workers are moving through the state.
I imagine their linguistic commonality with their clients matters in some cases a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of cases, and we might talk about this later, but community health workers finding employment as medical interpreters, but all definitely language skills being key.
Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do was step back and talk philosophically and politically with both of you. Both of your books talk about neoliberalism. In your case, how it affects healthcare and CHWs, and in your case, how it affects criminal justice systems. So I'll put the big question to you first. Can you define the term neoliberalism for us and tell us how it relates to your study?
Yeah, definitely. And Sebastian, please feel free to supplement my definitions. I'm not an economist by training, but when we think about neoliberalism, generally, we think about deregulation of markets, privatization of, if there's a public utility company, privatizing that. When we apply that to the healthcare system, we think about especially kind of this focus on the individual being solely responsible. It's your responsibility to be healthy, and it's your fault if you aren't healthy, essentially. We also think about the impact of the neoliberal approach in the healthcare system as treating health as a commodity, services to be bought and sold. And so for CHW communities, many of them working in marginalized and disadvantaged communities, you see communities being blamed for, well, you have all the tools available for you. Why are you not healthy? But not taking into account how structural factors such as why are they marginalized? Why are they experiencing inequality? How does policy marginalize them from healthcare? How does the economic opportunities available to them how are there not economic opportunities available that they can use then to get health insurance or pay for their healthcare? So CHWs are often helping their clients navigate those issues and those what resources are available. I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
So just, to complement and related to my specific work is that, as Ryan was saying, it's not simply an economic system. There's a whole reconstruction of society and the state. If you remember our good old friend, Margaret Thatcher, her famous sentence was that there's no society, there's only individuals. And then when she got hammered by the conservatives was there's only individuals and the family. But it's a complete reconfiguration of state responsibility. So if it's everything on individual responsibility, then the state is not responsible for whatever is happening. But the problem is that the consequences of that require state intervention. In my case, what I show is that there's a strong criminal justice intervention, the need to the development of what's called a politics of security, and the need to pacify populations that are marginalized but also pose a threat to the system in place.
So you cited Thatcher. People want a sort of historical thumbnail. Should we think of the neoliberal paradigm as being a 1980s thing? And it was preceded by something that was, we're doing an American context. FDR through the 1970s maybe was a more socialistic period in some ways.
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree to that too. Usually think about that kind of period ending this kind of Keynesian economics approach, almost ending with this rise of neoliberalism. And I think we're still in that to this day. We're still grappling with that.
So in your case, Ryan, we have had the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare as it's sometimes known, passed recently. Does that mitigate some of these effects? How does that play in?
So a lot of people like to couch, I think, the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare as socialized healthcare, but really it's essentially still the same neoliberal approach to healthcare as this commodity-based purchase kind of system. So, I didn't go too far into the ACA, mostly because it didn't have a lot of impacts for CHWs, but to a large degree, it's not really a way to, I think, combat the neoliberal influence in the healthcare system, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, so is there a particular CHW that it might be to talk more about, and maybe that would help us understand the ACA's limited impact?
Yeah, so there's a couple of CHWs in my book that were key informants. I cite them regularly throughout the book. Carmen is one of them. She was super interesting. Originally, a PhD in plant pathology, had worked as a scientist. I mean, this was a major difference for a lot of when I encountered with CHWs. She had been in the Peace Corps, so she actually spoke Portuguese, Spanish, and English fluently, and worked a lot with the undocumented Latinx population in South Central Indiana. And so she saw a lot of how at least this community that's completely excluded from the healthcare system through a policy standpoint, helping them navigate the resources that were available to them, the limited resources that existed. So she saw that, but also saw the impact of the neoliberal system in the healthcare system. She wasn't a volunteer, but she would speak to the fact that many CHWs were. She was one of two who worked on the staff at a hospital, which was rare at the time. And she would speak to how there was a devaluation of the skills that they brought. They weren't paid enough. For her, it was kind of like, I retired and I did this job out of passion for people. Other people need this job to make a living. And so, looking at how you see work being devalued, especially for a lot of CHWs that don't have an advanced degree, the work not being compensated. You see that on the global scale as well. So she's seeing it from both the patient perspective, but also as an employee within the healthcare system.
So who did Carmen work for? Who was her employer?
She worked for a pretty large hospital system based in South Central Indiana.
So this hospital system hires somebody like Carmen as a CHW so that she can help their patients interface with, is that right, with the hospital, generally speaking?
Correct. I think it kind of also speaks to a general issue I bring up a lot in my book, is that a lot of employers don't know how to utilize CHWs. They're not a well-integrated component of the workforce in the US. And so, I think almost in Carmen's case and her boss's case, who was also a community health worker, the fact that they both spoke Spanish fluently was kind of the main idea of bringing them in. We can have Spanish-speaking patients have a way to communicate in the healthcare system. And all these other skills that she has was not necessarily the focus of hiring her. It was more so for her language capability.
So your book seems to me to advocate on CHW's behalf. We've touched on this already. Can you talk about that aim and how the book can do that?
For CHWs? Yeah. For those of you who haven't read the book, a big focus of community health worker work, and a part of my argument in the book, is advocacy, the work that they do. So they're going to doctor's appointments, they're translating, but they're also speaking up for their patients. They might be attending political rallies in support of different causes that are affecting their communities. This, I argue, is a form of caregiving. A lot of times as they get integrated into the workforce, advocacy gets written out, it gets conflated with political activism. But even these kind of what I call micro level forms of advocacy, where they're on the phone with the health insurance rep, telling them, hey, I need to help get this person signed up, or a utility company saying, please don't, we have to figure out some way to not shut off their water or electricity. Let's find a way to manage this, are forms of caregiving as they keep this person in a state of well-being. In terms of the book being a form of advocacy for community health workers, I think it speaks back to this just spreading awareness, which is a major issue where people don't know what community health workers are, what they do. Yeah, which is not unusual. That's usually every presentation I give, even at anthropology conferences. Usually the second slide is the definition of a community health worker, just so we're all on the same page. I highlighted in my book, and you saw the graph that I have in there, that in Indiana, there are 75 terms that fall underneath the CHW umbrella. So you might be working with someone who's a title of a community health liaison and not know that that's technically a community health worker, which then doesn't help when you have people speaking about it, or when CHW show up in the doctor's office and doctors want to know, who is this person? Are they challenging my authority? You get all these power dynamic issues then. So the book is trying, I think, in those ways, just to highlight some of these issues and really bring awareness to community health workers.
So how many of them are there, like in Indiana?
So that was a big focus of mine when I was starting to do pilot research, just looking up CHWs, what are the numbers? The Bureau of Labor Statistics, I just checked it out this morning again. They have data from 2021, and they estimate between 1,200 to 7,700 community health workers in Indiana.
They don't know.
Basically, no. And I tell you that I interviewed 49 community health workers for my research, and it was a struggle sometimes to find community health workers. I interviewed a community health worker. I always asked, is there anyone else you think I should speak to? Yeah, my friend, she's a community health worker. I'll put you in touch with her. I drive over there the next morning. I go to interview her, and she tells me she's I think what I said earlier, community health liaison. And I said, oh, are you familiar with the term community health worker? She's like, no, I don't know what that is. And I explained it to her, and she said, oh yeah, no, that's what I am. So even people within that workforce are kind of unaware of some of that language.
So is this getting better? Is it like it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
I would say in Indiana's case, it's getting better. One of the frustrating, but also I think enticing things about doing work with community health workers is, especially in the US, it's such a patchwork system. Minnesota and Massachusetts have very robust community health worker programs, Medicaid reimbursement. Other states, Indiana, they were just starting to legislate community health workers, even though they had been working in the state for 30 years. I think it is getting better. They went with the term community health worker. There was some debate about that because it was in the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There had already been some previous reimbursable Medicaid codes that they decided, let's stick with that. But even the president of the CHW organization, who I collaborated with, who has been a CHW for 30 years, wasn't even sold on the term. She was afraid that community health worker over medicalized what CHWs do. There was too much focus on health in the word community health worker. And they do so much other work in terms of helping people get through into social services and other factors, that she was afraid if we start terming it this, and then we develop policy, how might this term run away from what we are at our core? And we saw some of those issues with the policy development that was going on.
The woman who was a community health liaison, I understand how that term might seem more fitting.
Correct. One of the things that comes across is you have a lot of community health workers that are employed in precarious positions. So what I mean by that is you have a social services agency or a community-based organization that gets a grant. They write a grant and they get 2 years of funding to hire blank, and they term that whatever is kind of they think is the best fit. So I've seen, roving community aid, community health liaison. You get the standard ones, promotor de salud, the Spanish-speaking community health worker. There's a bunch, but that's one of the reasons you see this proliferation of terms.
So you talk, I think, quite movingly about the burden of the work that CHWs, including burnout, and something that you call compassion fatigue. You also talk about how some of their clients don't take as much ownership of their own health as they might do. So what kinds of things do CHWs do to take care of themselves or draw boundaries?
Yeah, so focusing in on burnout was a key factor. There's not a lot written about burnout with community health workers, and the work is very strenuous. It's very people-based. You experience as a community health worker secondary trauma. So you're hearing somebody's traumatic story that happened to them, and inevitably that affects you and your mindset. So burnout was a massive issue that also is not really being addressed within the workforce. You don't want to integrate this workforce professionally integrate them into the workforce and then have them burn out. Some of the things they would do was varied, probably unsurprisingly: yoga, prayer, eating right, taking time off for yourself. I was interested especially in hearing about what are some things that employers can do, right? What are some applied things that are coming straight from the community health workers themselves? So there was a lot of talk about having things like a mental health day or a mental health hour, like a sick day, but you could take it for your mental health, or if you just needed some time after a difficult situation with a client. I think instituting things like making sure workers have access to professional therapy, right, through health insurance or some other benefit offered through their employer is key.
They help other people get care. They should be able to get it for themselves.
Exactly. And a lot of the CHWs would tell you, just because I clock out of work, I'm at my neighbor's house, that, my neighbor broke their leg, I'm going to mow their yard. And just doing this kind of, quotidian kind of, service to others was, off the clock. It kind of was nonstop.
Thanks. I think we've got a pretty good flavor of CHWs, and the audience can ask more questions, but let's turn to Sebastian now and let's hear about your book.
Thank you all.
Here it is. Here's Sebastian's book. And you can see the title there too. So it's not published yet, which is why I have it in that form. Can you tell us a little bit about its upcoming appearance?
So in the world of COVID that we still are, according to my editor, it should come by fall. I think she's a little bit too optimistic, but they are the voice of experience. So hopefully, by fall, maybe beginning of next year, but hopefully fall, it's going to be out.
Good. So when we're having this event in that semester, your book will be
Okay.
which is great.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay, great. So can you explain your title? So there's we can see it up there, phrase in quotation marks, Black, poor, and from the periphery.
So that's a translation of a common expression in Brazil, particularly in Sao Paulo, where I was, which is preto, pobre, periférico. And is in some ways the guiding line of the book. Definitely guides the 3 empirical chapters of it, and each one of those terms represents an element of the individual's identities, and in many ways, while there's not an equivalent expression of that in LA, I do believe that there's equivalence in the way that they develop their both racial, spatial, but also civic identity, and that's how it's framed. And each one is separated, but they also form a specific unit that has to do, and it's very much dialectically related with violence and state violence. So while at the same time it often serves as a way of resistance, the way it is defined and deployed has to do with its relation with, or its experience with particularly with violence in general and state violence in particular.
So it's the third word on the list, Black, poor, and from the periphery, that might be least familiar to people. So what does that mean in a Brazilian context?
So in a Brazilian context, but also, so there are 2 ways that I use it in the book. One way is geographical. So we have 4 cities, and then we have the periphery, in which generally, at least in the case of Sao Paulo, you have low-income neighborhoods, working-class neighborhoods, favelas, and so on. In LA, the urban structure is different because the periphery actually is in the core of the city. But I think that if we use the term exclusively in a geographical relation, we lose much of the term. I think that periphery also has to do with my location in the social and political economic structure. And in that sense, that's why it's also I also deployed it to understand LA.
So both of you guys did huge amounts of interviews. We talked about some technical stuff when I was talking with you, and your book, Sebastian, too, is full of technical and theoretical terms, but also it's got all this interview material. How did you think about balancing those two from a methodological?
So I think that my philosophical or theological approach, I would say also, I think that social life is interpreted, and therefore individual life experiences are a reflection of the way society is also organized, and I think that they need to be combined. So my book, it has an ethnographic approach, but the stories isolated don't make much sense unless we embed them in a historical, social, political, and economic context. And in that way, they also represent, or they also can explain or help us understand better the context and the history and the situations that we are trying to explain. So that's why I look at that. That means also that I don't have a neutral or objective approach. I'm not a fly on the wall. I never was. I try to avoid being an insect. I think that I very much embedded. That means that I influence the field. Ryan is much more knowledgeable than I am as an anthropologist in the world of ethnography, but also there's in all research, there's political, ideological intentions and so on. So I think that combination, at least that approach, I feel comfortable with it. At the same time, in the world, the world of social science and our attempts to generalize, we need to consider the scope of the book or the scope of our work. So I cannot speak to all cities in the world, but I think that the experiences of Sao Paulo and LA can inform other cities too. But that I will leave to other ethnographers to do.
So you're from criminal justice, Ryan's from anthropology. How does your book compare? I know this is a broad question, but to other work in your field.
So first of all, I'm a political scientist by formation. But my research interest has been and still is state violence. And that led me to do this, this big research that, led me to get a job here. And by force, by chance, by luck, I became a criminologist. I think that, social sciences, I think that it's one big family, and the boundaries that we design are very much not 100% artificial, but they're also in many ways, and there's a lot of cross boundaries and so on. So, in the same way that Ryan's work can inform all the other social science disciplines, I am, comfortable in being able to engage with conversations with other disciplines. Particularly in this case, because it's focused on police violence, and unfortunately, there's still a lot going on, both in the US and in Brazil. It directly addresses issues that are strongly, connected to the world of criminal justice and criminology.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? So you're multilingual, and you were interviewing people in Sao Paulo and in LA.
Yes.
So where are you from, and what languages were you speaking to people in?
So I'm from Uruguay. Grew up there. I grew up, my early childhood was during the military dictatorship. I think that is relevant to how I became interested in state violence, although I focus more on state violence deployed by democratic states, not necessarily authoritarian states. And as a child, we used to go quite a lot to Brazil for different reasons, but mostly to, diffuse some of the effects of the military dictatorship, cross the border and stay there for a while. That led me to learn Portuguese when I was a child through engaging with Brazilians and learning in the streets. And then I lived in Brazil also, just at an older age. I then immigrated to Israel. That's a different story. And then I came to the US to do my PhD. So in LA, so in Sao Paulo, I first of all, I knew Sao Paulo. I knew the area. I wasn't new there. I was quite familiar both with the cultural codes, with the language, and with people. Despite that, I had locals that guide me, help me, assist me, and particularly in the favelas, in the periphery, in the periphery you have neighborhoods, and then on the hills of those neighborhoods you have favelas, these large slum neighborhoods. So entering there, you have to enter with someone. it's a little bit dangerous to enter by yourself. And it's interesting because you go around and you're going to have young kids following you. And I remember asking, like, what the hell is going on? Like, I've seen these kids several times, and it's all like alleys and so on. So it's difficult. And basically, they're taking care of you. They want to know what the hell this guy is doing here. And if the kids are there, you're fine. You have to be concerned if they go away. But I knew the codes and so on. LA was tough for me for a couple of reasons. One, because I had never been in LA before. I didn't know the all the codes and so on. The interviews happen in Spanish or in English, depending on the subject that I was interacting with. I had locals helping me. I was a little bit more crazy in LA. I got there and just started going and walking the streets and asking weird questions to people until somebody told me, like, yeah, you're gonna get in trouble. So, and I was very lucky because I was able to meet a journalist there who she's been working in LA for ages, and particularly in South LA. And she actually studied anthropology. So she basically helped me navigate those waters. But it was tough because I didn't know the cultural codes, and there's a lot of tension between Latinos and African Americans, which African Americans have become a very much minority, and there's a lot of tension. So me going there, opening my mouth, okay, this guy is not Latino, what are you doing here, and so on. So I had more challenging things happening in LA than in Sao Paulo because of that.
So you interviewed lots of kinds of people, police officers.
So my focus is on residents mostly, their experience, but I also interviewed police officers, did ride-alongs with them, interviewed captains of different stations, both in Sao Paulo and LA. Although my focus is how residents of those areas experience policing and experience police.
So given that you were so critical of the way police work is done, was it tricky to be interviewing police officers? Were they forthcoming with you?
It depends. In some situations, yes, mostly street officers. After a couple of ride-alongs and so on, they would open up. I was open with, not completely open, but I was open about my research, what I was doing, my approach. We had honest, open conversations. I don't think that they would be surprised by the things many of the things that I criticize there. Some of the things are coming from them also. So it's not that they're completely on line of that. In Sao Paulo also, but Sao Paulo was a little bit tricky. So one is because in LA also, but it's a little bit dangerous to you've been talking to residents and then you go to a police station. So you need to manage that in a way that you need to protect yourself a little bit on what are you doing and how you do that stuff and so on. So that's one challenge, and I don't know how to solve it if somebody else is going to go and do that. And all my colleagues who do similar things, they all struggle with the same thing. In Sao Paulo, it was a little bit tricky because there's some type of rhetoric coming up from up. So in order to get honest officers to talk to me, I had to meet them outside of the area, outside of their working hours, in civilian clothes with a couple of beers, and then that will happen. In LA, I find it a little bit easier to engage with officers in a much honest way.
So back to the neoliberalism theme that links both of your work. You touched on it earlier during Ryan's portion of the interview. So how has the deregulation that we were talking about led to the incarceration patterns?
So there are a couple of things that happened during the 80s and so on in both cities that created a lot of a mess, in my view. And in many ways, it led to the rise of the carceral state, which it's not its only, but its main aspect is mass incarceration, but also has to do with the expansion of police powers, police violence, and so on and so on. And it has to do a little bit with what Ryan was telling. The deregulation of the state it's not the withdrawal of the state, because if you think, is the state changing it's changing its aspect. So the state decides to abandon, social and welfare services and go into the carceral state services. If you think, police officers, criminal justice, probation, all that stuff costs a lot of money. So it's not that the state, but it's a new way of looking at the individual. And the individual becomes human capital. So think about it for a moment in those terms, and it may help. So we are not workers anymore. We are human capital. And we need to enhance ourselves and so on, and make good choices, empower, entrepreneurial, all that stuff. And if we fail, it's because we made the wrong choices. It's not the state responsibility, not the system responsibility anymore. And therefore, the state doesn't have to intervene in those areas. It's the market and so on. So, but the problem doesn't go away. The fact that, there's so that's one aspect. The other aspect that is critical to these cities, and it's relevant to other global cities, is that in the 1980s, there was also a shift in economics. So we went through, the classic industrial 40s industries, unionized jobs in which, one salary could help one whole family, and you could, have some type of social mobility with the help of the state, etc. To, a large automatization, the anti-union policies, the reduction of union membership, the reduction of benefits, and so on. And many people in the US, it's critical to African Americans because it's the time of the civil, the success of the civil rights movement comes with these political economic changes. So a lot of lower class African Americans, when they had the opportunity to go into these good paying jobs, those jobs disappeared. In Brazil, it happened something similar. In the areas that I was studying, the big industries went away. And you had, these patterns, which are very much described by Saskia Sassen in Global Cities, in which you have very wealthy and very high-paying jobs, particularly in the area of finance or high-tech and so on, and very low-paying jobs in the area of services, etc. And for many areas like South LA or the periphery in Sao Paulo, you have, a lot of despair, and that tends to generate a lot of violence. And, and then you have all these cocktail of problems, and then some genius decides to send the police to solve them. And, as I said in another work, it's like you're putting the police to fail. You're putting them on a path to fail. Not because they're incompetent, not because they don't care, not because they don't want to, is they don't have, as an institution and as a system, the ability to solve those issues. And, you don't want to have frustrated officers with guns and the discretion to use lethal violence.
Thanks. I think I want to open things up soon to the audience, but you had talked earlier about embedding your work historically, and what you were saying now reminded me of the very interesting histories you gave of how these two cities, Sao Paulo and LA, were once little podunk towns, and then they grew up into these huge metropolises. And this has very much to do with the labor problems and the carceral situations you're talking about. Can you elaborate?
So both cities were basically almost irrelevant in colonial times. But in the case of Sao Paulo, what you had is coffee. So coffee actually worked really well in that area. So you had, a lot of coffee planters using slave work mostly. Later, when slavery was abolished, they started to bring European immigrants, part of the whitening process of Brazil. But that created a huge accumulation of wealth. So when, in the 1950s, they went into industrial import substitution industrialization, and the big industries came, there was enough wealth there to establish, and Sao Paulo became, this huge metropolis. And it still is. It's the economic center, the financial center of Brazil for sure, and definitely one, if not the economic center of Latin America. In the case of LA, what you had is first you had the port, and then you had the train line. So the advocates of the train lines and so on, they came, they were able to get the train up to the port in San Pedro, and that developed, and then what you had in LA is the coming of the during the World War II, the coming of the weapon industry, and then later, airplanes, all these federal contracts coming into the area that helped LA develop hugely as an industrial core. That industrial core is still in place, but it's a different type of industry. So now it's, not only Hollywood and all that stuff, but you have financial, industry there. So that made them into these huge global cities. And the interesting thing of global cities is that in a very short territorial distance, you can see the contradictions of the system. So we don't need to travel. So I was looking a while ago in Sao Paulo, for example, the distance between what locals call the noble neighborhoods, the wealthy areas, to the periphery where I was doing the research. If you look at Human Development Index, is the difference between Switzerland and Burkina Faso. But it's an hour, 2-hour drive by bus, or hour and a half if you get if the underground is connected. So one of the things that global cities, and LA the same, I did several times. And anybody who goes to LA, I have a student there that may go to LA, I told him to do it. I went from the UCLA campus down all the way Broadway Street up to South LA. And it's less than an hour drive. And the world changes, both linguistically, urban and economically. And that's one of the things that global cities have. Putting my research hat, it's one of the opportunities that the global cities give you to understand how, the inequalities of the political economic system.
Thank you. Okay, that's a lot to chew on. So thanks. Let's give more. I have a timepiece on me. How are we doing?
Would be 10 till 1.
Great. So we have tons of time to get a dialogue going. So I hope folks have questions for our panelists.
Well, thank you so much for the fascinating conversations. I got a lot of inspiration and scribbled on a lot of questions. I just asked one here. Like from the organizational communication perspective, what do you think are the major work motivations for the community health workers? You talked about, the challenges, the burdens, and so on, but what makes them stay in that occupation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that was a focus of my work quite a bit, was digging into why community health workers do the work that they do. And a big aspect of that was a sense of obligation and commitment. I'll share the story of one CHW who I spoke with, who, when I was interviewing her, what motivates you to do the work that you do? She had said this, she had this health problem in the past. At the time she was monolingual, only spoke Spanish. And after struggling for a while to figure out what to do about this, how to get help, someone helped her essentially. And that's what gave her that spark. And a lot of CHWs speak to that. One of the questions I would ask, it was kind of a two-pointed question. It was, how long have you been a CHW? And how long have you officially been a CHW? Because a lot of CHWs you'd speak to, when I was 4 years old, I used to go to my church and I would hand out food to the homeless or something. And that's what started me on my journey. I might not have known it was called a community health worker, but once I found out, that was it. And so I've officially worked for 8 years, but technically, 35. So really, I think that's a key of community health workers, is unlocking that commitment, that obligation that they already have for their communities, and finding ways to leverage that to improve health outcomes.
My question's for Sebastian. And basically it's kind of twofold. My research is on the history of immigrant detention in the US. So I'm very familiar with the connection between the neoliberal state and the growth of carceral systems. So I'm curious how, now that you've presented what is more the commonality between LA and Sao Paulo and this concept of the periphery, where's the difference in terms of how the neoliberalism is changing the carceral state? I can imagine it has something to do with the police, since that's what you're looking at. And then because I know, based on living in Brazil, that the level of policing is very different there in terms of military police and that structure. But can you speak to that? And can you speak to the difference in the carceral system too, in terms of incarceration?
Yeah, so thank you very much for asking that. So my one of the broad arguments that I'm making is that actually they share similar experiences. There is a difference. There's a difference in magnitude of violence, and I think that matters. I'm not, making that level of violence irrelevant. I think that it's important to address and to try to understand. but the effects of policing and the effects of police violence are shared by residents of both areas, which, surprised many of my US colleagues when, how dare to compare and say that Brazil and the US share similar experiences. There's a difference of magnitude, and that's important and has to do with, different structures and different ways in which the police evolved. The police in Brazil has, the street police is called the military police. In its name, it's already militarized. They have a structure that it's much more, vertical. And part of the issue is that, there's a separated police. So you have the military police, you have the civil police. The civil police is the one in charge of investigating crimes. The military police is the one that roams the streets. And the streets patrol, most of the killings happen by military police officers. And the conditions in which that happens are much more, extreme. So that's basically my point, that there's a difference in magnitude. You look at the numbers and you can see it. Although, so for example, if you take police killings only, which is, generally what we look, because it's the easiest thing to count. Although in the US you don't have any type of official numbers, which is interesting, in a country that is so crazy about statistics that there's no official number on that. So in the US, you have around 2,000 people killed by the police every year, the whole country. In Brazil, in Sao Paulo only, you have official numbers, an average of 500, which that means that you're close to 1,000. Because, you need to count the people that are disappeared by the police and so on. So there's a huge difference in magnitude. There's a difference in violence also. The drug business is more concentrated in different areas. That produces, Brazil is one of the main transits it's not a producer of drugs. There's some areas here and there, but it's mostly a transit place. And, the prison system is a disaster. Not that here it's wonderful, but in that terms. On the other hand, and this may be important, in Brazil, you have social democratic parties that win elections, which you don't have in the US. And if we are talking about challenging neoliberalism and reconstituting some type of welfare state or some type of services and so on, Brazil did it since, started with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, then definitely it increased with Lula, still inside a neoliberal framework, still inside a very capitalist framework, still, basically based on cash transfer. But I think that it produced significant effects. There's no such a political alternatives, Bernie Sanders maybe, but, in the US. And if we are looking to challenge that and to, reduce harm in society, that could be a path.
Did you have a question?
I was going to ask the same question.
Okay. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. I have a brief comment for both of you, and then a question that might be more for Sebastian, but perhaps both. So first of all, I wanted to thank you both for spending some time explaining neoliberalism. That's something I spend a lot of time trying to teach my history students, and I appreciate that you, despite the liberalism in the name, how deceptive that is, right? Pointing out that it's actually, very conservative, if not reactionary ideology. It's not at all liberal. So thank you for that. My question is, I was listening you both, and in part, this is shaped by a book I was very recently reading that I'm reviewing. I found some interesting parallels between what you're both talking about and settler colonialism. The situation where the elite ally with government forces for the most part to create a racialized socioeconomic system of healthcare, criminal justice, employment, et cetera. And I was wondering if you thought about that or if you see any direct connections between your work and those ideas.
Sebastian, you should take this because your book does hit that.
Definitely, yes. We can, if we are rooting our analysis in history, we cannot ignore those patterns. So there are a couple of things I'm trying to see. So one, there has been a system in place, or there has been an historical attempt to define the nation and define its members, and that has been very much racialized. And and it has changed who is inside and who's outside. It evolves and so on, but it has been very much so. Both countries, in many ways, whiteness has been one element that has been pursued. And therefore, those who are not, present a threat to the system, and therefore they need to be policed, right? But it's very much embedded also in political economy. That doesn't mean that racism crosses class, but the experience of racism is completely different depending on class. So that's one element that it's important, and one of the things that I try to do is to show how racism produces race. So in other words, the first empirical chapter, which is about being Black, is how individuals who may phenotypically not be considered Black define themselves as Black because of their experience with state violence. Okay? So one of the stories that I have there is this guy that gets beaten by the police in the middle of the night in his house, and the police decides to leave him alone. And when I ask him like why they were beating you if you had nothing to do with anything, and he looks at me, he says, because I'm a Black bastard. But phenotypically, he looks like me. But in his experience with, so one of the things that I try to show is how violence becomes central in this construction of identities. At the same time, and that has to do with these roots of what you're talking of colonialism and racism and so on. But at the same time, the fact that racism still exists and the fact that we still have races, despite the fact that they're not biological, but they're social construction, has to do with the practices that now. It has to do with the practices that happen now. It's not as simple, it's not that we are replicating slavery or New Jim Crow or those type of things. There's a context in place now, rooted in history, that it's being reproduced. And it's being reproduced for a series of, perspective, has to do with political economy, has to do with social elements and so on, that it's being reproduced. So the fact that, and I look at it in a dialectical way. So you suffer violence because you're Black, and you're Black because you suffer violence. You cannot simply, disentangle both. Both in the case of LA and in the case of Sao Paulo. And that happens, and that has to go with the context in which we are, in which those areas are seen as a threat, are seen as spaces of war that need to be pacified. And therefore, state violence is deployed there, and in that deployment, it produces and reproduces these racial hierarchies.
I'll add a little bit, I guess. I just immediately thought about a lot of the CHWs that I collaborated with, worked with undocumented immigrants, and looking at, one example that came to mind during this discussion right now was a CHW who was explaining to me, I think I was asking her about burnout, and she was kind of describing essentially the effects of structural violence on undocumented immigrants, where you have, in her case, she said, I had this kid I was helping, he was undocumented, he was having a mental health crisis, and I could take him to get evaluated for his mental health issue, but it would stop there, because even though the resources are there, we have the treatment options, the therapy is there, he can't afford it, doesn't qualify for insurance, and so we're just stuck. And to her, that was, morally damaging to her. It hurt her to not be able to help this person through this, mental health crisis that they were having. And I think that's where we see maybe some of those that settler colonialism, at least in regards to the healthcare system, come in. I just took a lens of structural violence for that.
Yes, thank you both for the conversation to start with. And I have a question I think kind of crosscuts, maybe unifies a little bit what you're both talking about. I had the opportunity on Friday to hear a paper that looked at the connections between your addiction as a healthcare issue versus addiction and drug use as a policing issue. And so I wondered if you could comment kind of through the lens of your research, how we might best approach those potential contradictions, potential opportunities, however you see it.
I was going to say we need more Ryan and less me. But, you know, so let's focus on the war on drugs. So the war on drugs has permeated and has crossed, like it has become worldwide. And, you know, if anybody here is studying public policy and wants to study one of the hugest failures in public policy, study the war on drugs, you know, because there's probably nothing failed as big and continues to fail as the war on drugs. But that has to do with neoliberalism and a different approach. So, you know, it's this idea that the individual is responsible for addiction, and it's this choice. Well, look at the Reagan's campaign on the war on drugs, and you know, Nancy Reagan. What was the whole campaign? Just say no, and that's still very much in place. You know, I have my kids in the school system here, and they still are told, say no. You know, so there's no any type of analysis, and the people who come and say no, they're not health workers who are giving them, you know, information on what are the effects of drugs, what are the problems, and so on. And it's say no on illegal drugs, forget about alcohol and so on. So, but there's no conversation on consumption and why people consume. If you take into consideration the data here in the US and you add alcohol and prescriptive drugs, you're gonna get to 75% of consumers in the last month. Like they're gonna say, I consume some of those. But nobody's asking why the US is a society that, you know, consumes the levels that consumes. So you have that issue, you have addiction, you know, mostly eliminated any type of help, and I imagine Ryan can speak more to that, help in regarding addictions and so on. And you criminalize it, but you criminalize consumption. Yes, you know, traffic is also criminalized, but most people arrested are for consuming. And, you know, and again, I go back to this idea is that you're setting the police to fail. You know, I'm very critical of the police, and I think that the police shouldn't be involved in any of these issues, and it's problematic. But even if I was, you know, very, you know, fond of whatever, part of the issue here, and I remember having discussions with public officers, like public officials in Uruguay and other places, is to put the police to solve this problem, is to put them to fail. They have no possibility, no matter how much training you give them. They're not gonna, you know, so yeah, and it has to do with that idea, with that conceptualization, that neoliberal conceptualization of the individual, in which, you know, there's no society. So the fact that we live in a society that is highly addicted to drugs has nothing to do with me, because it's that person that chooses to do it. So if he had nothing to do with me, I can sleep well at night, and I have no responsibility whatsoever. So I have no responsibility as a member of society, less the state. But the problem is there. So, you know, and this is I think that, and with this, I'll finish with that answer, but it's also important to understand what the police embodies here. Because the police embodies violence. Not that they use violence, most of the time they don't use violence, but they embody state violence. It's not simply that they are authorized to use violence, they represent state violence. So when you define a problem that has to be policed, what you are saying is that that problem needs to be addressed through violence. There are certain issues that may require the use of violence. I don't think drug consumption is one of those, and many others. But that's important to understand. And that generates, you know, it generates on the problem. And I'm looking at Christian because he's doing his research and I'm working with him. You know, I'm trying to help him. But as he interviewed officers are frustrated on that. And, you know, ask everybody, ask Christian then on his experience talking to officers about this.
So what came to mind immediately for me, and I didn't want to be on my phone looking this up and thinking I wasn't paying attention, but so I'm not going to say the quote, but it's a Shirley Chisholm quote, and you can find it really easily if you look up, you know, maybe like addiction and Shirley Chisholm. Those of you who don't know, she was the first Black woman to be elected to U.S. Congress, I think in the 70s. But she has a quote that basically falls along the lines of, when you look at something like addiction, basically connecting to how society causes people to fall into addiction. I talk a lot in my medical anthropology courses how we often are, you know, in society, we see addiction as that neoliberal concept where it's you failed as an individual, you're addicted, that's your fault, and you have to figure out what to do. And it's often highly stigmatized and marginalized. to the point where the Surgeon General, I think in 2016, had to release a report to say addiction is a brain disease. It's not something to be stigmatized. In fact, I tell my students, anything that's stigmatized, that should be a red flag for you to stop and ask, why is it stigmatized? What about the person who has it is stigmatized? Why are they? There's nothing natural about stigmatization. It's something we're putting forth as a society on often a group of people that have some sort of, disease or in this case, a brain disease like addiction. There are CHWs that worked with people who were in recovery. There was a whole sect of CHWs that were called certified recovery specialists. And they often had been through either they were still dealing with mental health, something like depression or bipolar or whatever, or they had been through, some sort of substance use disorder. And they were able to use their story to help people in that. So I think really through that lived experience again of being a CHW who had that was particularly effective at helping people in their recovery process. And I think what also came to mind, it didn't come to fruition ultimately in Indiana, but they had trained a group of paramedics as community health workers, these community paramedics, to expand their mindset as they approach people with social issues that they were experiencing. There had been talks about training some of the Indianapolis Police Department to go through the community health worker training, also to kind of broaden their understanding of how social issues affect people's health. But with this kind of idea of embedding a community health worker to be employed by the police department that would go on calls, or if they knew there was a person having, a mental health issue or something, a CHW who was trained in that could go instead of the police or go with the police, and they would take the forefront in that interaction. That didn't happen, unfortunately, but there's avenues I think that can branch some of those issues.
Questions, yes?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very interesting talk. My question goes to Logan. Community health workers, are they board certified, or do they have like a body that certify their profession? If they don't, will that help to at least elevate their importance in the health industry? Because it looks as if they are underappreciated, given all what they do to close that gap between the professional, what they call the professional community workers, and then those who are working at the community level.
Yeah, that's a great question. I was lucky enough when my research started, they were implementing a certification process that was backed by the state government. I think I maybe mentioned just briefly in one of my answers that sometimes CHWs would be met with suspicion or condescension in the healthcare encounter. So you'd have a CHW go with a person to their doctor's appointment. The doctor would walk in and be like, who is this person? Why are you talking? What's your authority here? Oh, I don't even know what a community health worker is. Now feel like I'm on the defense. So there'd be this power dynamic. And I spoke to how this is due to lack of awareness, but part of trying to address this issue was let's have a certification. It'll be like a pseudo degree. Most community health workers graduated high school for the most part, and they didn't go on to higher education. So we give them a certification. They get a new title, certified community health worker, with the idea being to legitimize them professionally into the workforce. So to answer your question, it depends on every state. And, you could expand that to countries also where community health workers operate. So certification was one tool. They, in Indiana, were instituting reimbursable codes through Medicaid that would be for CHW specific services. So now employers have an incentive, they can get reimbursed for their CHW employers. Those codes were very restrictive and people don't really use them from what I understand. But yeah, so certification though, that was one step towards what I call professional legitimacy, building their professional legitimacy.
Just to follow up on that, so do you know kind of what the state of affairs is in California? Is there a system here that's more or less robust?
So I started doing some research. Finally, COVID stopped things for quite a while. I have a project now looking at the experiences of community health workers in the US-Mexico border region, the Central Valley, and the Bay Area. It's all still pretty formative right now. What I've encountered a lot is there is not really a true, and if anybody knows, please let me know. But there's not like a true unified CHW movement. There's very strong, like promotor, coalition. San Diego has one, LA has one. There is what's called the California Community Health Workers Community of Practice. And this is an organization, I've spoken with the woman who runs it a couple times. She is trying to create this statewide unification, but what she has come up against a lot is territorial disputes where people don't know what her motivations are, or there's tension there. And so as a researcher, it becomes very difficult because if you align yourself with this organization, then no one wants to talk to you, or they're suspicious of you at this organization. So that's kind of what I've seen in the landscape. I haven't gotten a chance to dig into it very deeply. I got to do some research last summer and interview some CHWs. But yeah, to answer your question, it seems actually, to me, it seems more fractured than Indiana that had this statewide movement that was very clear, even though we're centrally based Indiana in Indianapolis, which is the biggest city there. We are for CHWs all over the state. Here, there seems to be more tension.
So someone from online watching us, Bessie Udy says, I'm noticed for Ryan, I'm noticing how often you refer to CHWs as she or her, or when sharing experiences. Can you speak a bit to what you've learned about gendered nature of formal and informal CH work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't get a chance to get into that. So in my sample of CHWs I spoke with, it was something like at least 80% were identified as women. And that speaks a lot to just kind of gendered conceptions about women are natural caretakers. I'm all air quotes for this, right? This kind of inherent nature of women as being caregivers. I didn't go too far into that with my research, taking kind of the lens of gender to this. There is work that's been done that looked at, we're really missing out on men having more male CHWs. I spoke to CHWs who would describe, as a woman, sometimes men don't want to open up to me about issues, especially if it's something like a sexually transmitted infection, or if it's talking about a prostate exam. And so there's a barrier that would emerge from that. And CHWs talked about ways to get around that. One would tell me, oh, I call it the grandma effect, but basically this guy isn't going to see me as a sexual partner. So maybe he'll be more open to speaking with me about his health issues. So that is a major topic. It's something that I want to explore more in my research, future research. But yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Oh, no, somebody else has got a question. Mine's not that good.
Oh, it's me. This is like my first time doing anything like this. I kind of don't know a lot. Obviously, I'm a student. But I had a question. What is pilot research? You mentioned that, and I just want to know what that is.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I wouldn't have even raised my hand if I was an undergrad right now. I didn't even talk in my undergrad classes. I was like so scared. So thank you for that. So pilot research is what I did in terms of I had my research questions, what I thought they were going to be, these questions that guide my research that I'm going to do my research on to answer. So the year before my dissertation research, the summer before, I went to Indiana and I just met with as many people as I could, whether they were CHWs, they were just somewhere in the healthcare field, and just ask them questions.
So it was kind of just like a smaller sample before moving on to like the bigger one?
That's correct. Yeah, I think, I interviewed like 20 people and I wound up talking to maybe half of them again, and the other half, it didn't really pan out. But just to kind of situate myself in the field when I'd be going back the following year and really build those connections. Sebastian, do you want to add?
Yeah, so basically it gives you the opportunity to sharp a little bit more your questions and challenge some of the assumptions that you have. So in my case, I was able to go to Sao Paulo, not to LA, but I was able to go to Sao Paulo a year before I really went and did the research. And, I went with a research plan, a research question, a set of ideas, a set of assumptions. I went into the field, I started talking to people, I came back, throw everything away. And it didn't happen when I went to do the big research, but actually the way my work and my articles and now the book is being shaped is very different from what I thought I was going to get when I reached there. Anthropologists can tell, that generally that happens when you go into the field and you do that stuff. That means that you need to have quite a bit of an open mind to allow the field to guide you. You still need the guidelines, because if not, you can go, to places that are not relevant to what you're looking for. But you need also to allow that. And a pilot, it's always a very good thing to do, because it's small, less risks. They're not going to fail you in a dissertation defense or thesis defense, but it allows you to sharp much of the theories, assumptions, the questions, and so on.
Thank you.
Greg, did you have something?
My turn now? Yeah, why not? So Saba, you mentioned 3 empirical chapters. Maybe briefly as possible, a little bit about the methods and, what they were empirically.
So so everything is based on ethnographic interviews. So that's the method that I use. And ethnographic interviews is, so imagine an interview that we're having now, but rather than, you have a set of questions, a little bit like what happened now. You have a set of questions, but it's mostly a dialogue. So I sit with Greg, and I start talking, and I start asking about his life and his experience and so on, and I start to navigate in those areas until I start pushing or trying to get into the area which I'm interested in. In my case was, okay, what's your experience with, with violence, with police violence, and so on. Generally, they come up. I don't need to push that much, but it's basically having a conversation rather than a questionnaire in which I'm asking questions. And, it's a dialogue, and the setting also is very important on where you have it. So in my case, was mostly like some of them happen in the middle of the street. Some of them happen in schools, with teenagers and so on. A lot of them happen in the streets, a lot of them. Some in more formal settings, police station, a police car when I was doing police officers, but also, as I said, in a bar with a couple of beers. People would think that I had some type of urinary infection, because they would talk and I would and I couldn't take notes there. So I would rush to the restroom and with my phone and take notes as much as I can, because they were interesting things. But you do that. So that's basically, so that's the method that I took, because my focus was, I want to learn from their experiences, how policing and police violence affects their lives. And I came up with those 3 elements because what I saw, it's not that I have one character for each. They cross and they come and so on. And they talk about everything. I analytically change it. And what I look is at how, these experiences, one, define their racial identity, how people define themselves as Black, or in the case of Latinos in LA, they tend to make this distinction between white Latinos and non-white Latinos. And that's very much their experience with violence. Space, how space is defined, how police officers define the space, and they feel that they're in a war area or war zone and so on. And also, this idea of periphery, how the residents there see themselves as people who are marginalized, who are pushed outside of the core, and so on. And then poor, it's a classic socioeconomic status. I shifted a little bit to understand also how it translates to the world of rights. And basically what I argue, or what I show through their stories, is that they start to develop this sense of being second-class citizens. And then I have a 4th one, which is not necessarily empirical in the sense that the interviews are telling me, but which is one of the broad claims, that what I argue is that these areas, South LA and Sao Paulo periphery, are what I call authoritarian enclaves. In other words, there are places in which democracy in practice doesn't exist, in which there's a constant systematic violation of rights. And it's, and there are authoritarian practices in which, a lot of arbitrary things happening, not necessarily physically violent, but a lot of arbitrary things happen that leads people in those areas to think, not only I'm a second-class citizen, but I'm not worthy of rights. I don't have rights. They're in a piece of paper, I understand them, I comprehend them, but they're meaningless in my daily interaction, in this case with the state.
Cheery note. Maybe we should mingle and eat food, especially if we haven't had a bite yet. So thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.